If you haven't changed after the 7th of October, something is wrong about you. I was telling one of the leaders of the Haredi parties, I was saying exactly this. I told him, you haven't passed the 7th of October. You're not a part of it.
When we talk about manpower, this is an illusion. The IDF has no lack of manpower. I repeat, no lack of manpower. The only problem is that the IDF in the last 2 decades have minimized combat units. And that was a misconception because of what happened after October 7.
Welcome to the Misgab Institute for National Security's Mideast Horizons, the podcast for anyone who wants to truly understand what's happening in the Middle East beyond the headlines and spin. I'm Lahav, your co-host, a Misgab Institute Senior Fellow and Senior Political Correspondent for Jewish Insider.
And I'm Asher Friedman, your co-host and Executive Director of the Misgab Institute for National Security. The Misgab Institute is Israel's leading national security policy center focused on strengthening Israel's security, its regional cooperation, and its international standing. Every week, we'll go beyond the headlines and cut through the noise to bring you fresh insights and analysis, both on the most burning issues on the national security agenda in the Middle East, but also on the trends and the opportunities taking shape in this incredible region.
Please subscribe and follow wherever you listen to podcasts to keep up to date and ahead of the curve on everything connected to the Middle East and Israel. You can reach out to us with comments and suggestions at mideasthorizonspodcast@gmail.com.
This week, we're going to take a deep dive into the contentious issue of the Ultra-Orthodox draft in Israel, the attempts to draft members of the Ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi parties, into the IDF, an issue that may lead to elections and the collapse of the government. We'll speak to 2 members of Knesset on opposite sides of this debate, to member of Knesset Moshe Kinley Tur-Paz of the Yesh Atid party, and to former member of Knesset Moshe Roth of the United Torah Judaism party. Each one will present his perspective on this issue.
First, we're going to talk about the latest news. We can't avoid talking about the food situation in Gaza. There's been endless headlines, pictures of really just tragic photos of children who appear to be starving, although we'll get to why what they appear like isn't everything. But, you know, on the front pages of newspapers all over the world, a lot of heat on Israel. And then so Israel instituted what they called humanitarian pauses, 10 hours a day, no fighting in certain areas, creating corridors, airdropping aid. And so there's just been a flood of humanitarian aid in the last couple days.
This is obviously a critical issue and an issue that's been dominating the headlines and having a very serious impact on public opinion regarding Israel from President Trump on down. We have to separate fact from fiction and separate the conditions of a scarcity of food in the Gaza Strip and in the war zone from the accusations that Israel is deliberately starving the Gazans. Those two are not necessarily connected.
By the way, sorry, when you talk about separating fact from fiction, it's in 2 directions, right? Which Israelis and supporters of Israel, some of them don't want to even admit that there is an issue of food insecurity, maybe not for everyone in Gaza, but certainly for many people in Gaza. They don't want to admit it because that's almost like admitting Israel did something wrong or admitting defeat in some way. And I think that the fact pattern is pretty clear that even if there's, you know, hundreds of trucks worth of aid waiting at the crossing, it's not getting to all of the people who need it. Now, that is, as you said, that is very much distinct from a policy of starvation, right? But I think that in both directions, both the people who support Israel and the people who are against Israel are presenting this as like many of them, not all, are presenting it as a black and white issue, when in fact it's an issue that's quite nuanced. But when you want to tell people that, and what the picture they see on the front cover of a newspaper, baby that they think is starving, then you could see why, you know, they don't think this is a good time for nuance.
Absolutely. And when you see those heartbreaking photos of, you know, children looking like skeletons, it's very hard to take a step back and try to analyze the situation. And I've said this over and over again, that I don't think anybody should be denying the extent of suffering and the extent of the destruction and devastation in Gaza. And of course, food insecurity is an aspect of that. When we look at the different elements of what's actually happening. So you have one element where you had the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation mechanism, which was bringing in tens of millions of meals into the southern Gaza Strip, and then a Hamas UN campaign against that mechanism, primarily because that cut Hamas and cut the UN out of the deal. You have this issue of the hundreds of trucks that are waiting to be distributed by the UN and the UN's limited capability of distributing that.
I would say it's not just an issue of limited capability, it's an issue of willingness, right? Because they didn't like what the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was doing, and so they refused to work with them, even though the GHF probably could have helped them distribute.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And GIF are somebody we interviewed, Johnny Moore. He's come out and said, we're happy to help you distribute. We have the capacity. And the UN said, no, we're not willing to work with you. You're not humanitarian enough. You're not one of us. Then you have the issue of the fact that Hamas continues to steal and hoard aid and provide it where it wants to provide it, not provide it where it thinks that there's challenges to its rule or to people who are threatening their continued dominance. And the last issue, which is very difficult, but and again, like you said, how much room for nuance is there? But there have been at least 3 cases of images that have gone viral showing very, very starving children who look like skeletons. And as a father, that's heartbreaking. But again and again and again, so in 3 separate cases already, it's turned out that this wasn't an issue of starvation due to lack of food. These were children who tragically had pre-existing complex medical conditions. And obviously, one of them had left Gaza with Israeli coordination to seek medical attention elsewhere. I believe the other 2 cases, that wasn't possible. And for example, in one very famous image, so you have this mother who looks healthy, holding a child that's clearly starving, but right next to the child in an image that was either cropped or just wasn't used, you have that child's brother who also looks healthy.
So it's a photo set, right? I think it was the Associated Press, but I'm not sure. One of the news agencies took these photos, and they took, 5 or 6 photos of this family, right? So the photo that people chose to use is of this baby using a trash bag as a diaper. By himself, right? Basically clutching his mother's mouth, holding him, and you see his spine and his ribs, and it's horrifying. It's terrible. But then, of course, in the other photo, he's wearing a normal diaper or a normal disposable diaper, and a child next to him that seems perfectly healthy. But I want to say that I think that this argument kind of misses the point. Like, I just don't think it just doesn't convince anyone. And I've seen some of the responses from people who, let's say, are like a little bit more neutral, or there's some like Palestinian anti-Hamas voices who have gained prominence since the war. And they've said, like, this child is suffering. Like, the child is still suffering, whether it's not for the exact reason you say it is or not. So, like, I know a lot of pro-Israel people keep bringing this up, and I think that it's a testimony to the dishonesty and laziness of a lot of the international media, but I don't think it's a winning argument when the idea you're trying to put forward is the true idea that Israel is not starving people.
Right. I think that Israel has been trying to prevent food and fuel from falling to the hands of Hamas, from serving Hamas. They've been working to try to separate the population from Hamas, because as long as Hamas dominates the population, you'll never get to a day after. You'll never get to any kind of lasting ceasefire. It's been therefore trying to provide the food via the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, trying to find avenues for providing food in ways that don't reach Hamas. It certainly hasn't been implementing a policy of intentional starvation. But the fact is that given the ongoing war, given Hamas's presence, given the difficulties of distributing food, I think it is true that you have this issue of food insecurity. Now, whether the correct response was what Israel has chosen to do, and you can up to this, is to basically start flooding in food and start flooding in through the UN again and through airdrops again, which again will likely lead it to ending up in the hands of Hamas, or whether it should have tried to more quickly scale up the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation mechanism, I think is an important question. But yeah. I agree with your point, which is what, we do have to recognize the situation on the ground.
Yeah, I wish they could have scaled up the GHF much more quickly. I mean, they are distributing, the numbers of meals they claim to be distributing every day is crazy. I mean, I think that it's true. I think they really are distributing that much food every day. from what I can tell, but it's massive. So maybe it's just not possible to scale up more quickly. That would have been the ideal situation. And I think what people outside of Israel don't understand as much is that inside Israel, first of all, like by the media for the past 22 months, and sure, like, you don't see a lot of pictures of what's going on in Gaza in the Israeli news because it's not the first thing in the news. You know what I mean? It's like if you're watching the news for half an hour, then you'll see, and it's not hidden. It's just not prioritized, which makes sense, right? People want to know what's happening to them, their neighbors, their country first. But I think that the story that Israelis have been told about humanitarian aid, which again, not a false story, is that Hamas steals a lot of it. And so there needs to be a mechanism to keep it away from Hamas. And then suddenly the government turned on a dime and says, we're flooding Gaza with aid. We're dropping it from the air. So clearly there's no way to stop Hamas from getting it. So you see from a lot of corners in Israel, and not the far right at all. I mean, yes, the far right, but also center. You see a lot of Israelis that are confused and disappointed in what's going on now. I think ultimately, it's almost an admission, maybe defeat is too strong of a word, but I think that it's an admission. It just didn't do a good job in figuring out this policy because the problem still remains. Even today, the IDF spokesperson released a video of Hamas stealing aid from a truck, right? And I'm sure they released it in response to a New York Times story that denied that was happening. But it's almost as if the government has said, we wash our hands of this. Like, we don't want people to starve. We obviously haven't stopped Hamas from stealing, so we're just going to give them. I think it shows a lack of planning and a lack of strategy from the government, which is unfortunate.
I agree entirely. And I think the issue of humanitarian aid has been poorly managed on a strategic and a tactical level by Israel, by the IDF since the outset of the war. There's also been people claiming, for example, that we're sort of giving these concessions to Hamas by essentially providing them with food that they need for their fighters and to maintain their control. And we haven't got anything in return. We haven't got any of our hostages back out. So you're right that it's not just on the right. There's a lot of confusion or disappointment over the mismanagement of this entire issue from different parts of the political spectrum in Israel. Lahav, do you have a better idea though of what can you just update our listeners as to what's actually been happening over the last few days since Israel has decided to surge aid?
These humanitarian pauses for 10 hours a day and humanitarian corridors, which means certain areas of Gaza not going to be fighting, and the passage for Gazans to reach the areas where aid is being distributed. There's aid being dropped from the air, that's smaller quantities of aid. And some of it comes from Israel. Like it's literally Israeli donated aid to Gazans because Israel just wanted to get this started. Some of it's coming from Jordan. There's aid coming from Egypt, which I think might even be the first time that has happened. The Emiratis have been sending aid to Gaza all along, by the way. That's been like a nonstop thing. And the UN has finally started picking up some of these trucks of aid that have been waiting for them and distributing. So within the first couple days, after Israel was like, no, we're not starving. Come, you are the ones who are not giving food to Gazans, right? Like since Israel made this public at the end of last week, they then distributed 30% of the trucks within 2 days. So the last number I saw was that on Monday, they distributed 200 trucks of aid, the UN and other international aid organizations, but that there were still 260 trucks waiting. So hopefully they'll be able to scale that up. Israel is continuing this humanitarian pause thing, the daily pauses for the foreseeable future. There's no current deadline on this.
So Lahav, I wanted to take us to another arena, and that is the Iranian arena. We saw that Iran is resumed negotiations with the E3, with Germany, with France, and with the UK. They have not restarted negotiations. They've said they're not having negotiations with the Trump administration. And we're coming up to some very critical deadlines very soon. The Snapback mechanism, which was part of the original JCPOA, when President Obama wanted to explain why this was a good deal, he said, well, if Iran violates, we can always just snap back all the sanctions, and there are a lot of sanctions from before the 2015 JCPOA. So there are sanctions and restrictions on Iran's nuclear program, its military program, its ballistic missile program, its financial system. And most of those sanctions were rolled back as part of the JCPOA. Now, the official deadline for the snapback mechanism is October 18th. If October 18th goes by and the parties have not used the snapback mechanism, then the possibility of reenacting all those original sanctions disappears. But it's really a lot before October 18th because there's a 30-day process and a dispute resolution mechanism, and Russia's going to have the presidency of the Security Council in October. Really, if the EU doesn't take action by the end of August or early September, it's going to be very difficult to restore these sanctions.
So the EU has said that if there's no deal reached by the end of August, then they will snap back sanctions. My understanding from a very senior Israeli official who said soon after the Europeans said that he and other high-ranking American officials tried to convince Europe to just do it earlier because the U.S. doesn't see the threat of snapback sanctions as contradicting what they're trying to do in the talks, right? There's the carrot and the stick, right? That's just another stick to try to convince Iran to enter some sort of agreement. But the Europeans have decided to wait and exhaust the possibility of agreement before even putting this additional pressure of sanctions on Iran, which means we probably are going to have to wait another month or so to see what they're going to do. And it's just a race against the clock, right? Time is running out.
One key issue that we're going to see around the Iran talks is what issues are on the table. So Iran's been very clear that they're willing to talk about the nuclear file and to talk about sanctions. But this host of other issues, whether the ballistic missile threat, which Israel sees as an existential threat, their support for terrorist actors across the Middle East, their sales of military systems to Russia, their military cooperation with China. From Iran's perspective, that's not on the table, and even their basic right to enrichment is not even on the table. The only thing that's going to be discussed are the levels of enrichment and oversight. So we're going to run up, I think, against a challenge where you may have some countries in Europe, and what the United States position on this is, which says, okay, if we can get to an agreement on the nuclear issue and oversight, then we can just, basically ignore these other issues. And from Israel's national security perspective, the ballistic missile threat, the terror threat, the destabilization are also critical to its national security. And Israel has said that it will act in order to prevent Iran from rebuilding its ballistic missile program.
So we are going to move on to our next topic and our guests next. I will introduce our two guests and tell you a little bit about the topic. So we have a member of Knesset Moshe Kinley Tur-Paz of Yesh Atid, the opposition party. He's an educator by profession, but he also, I think, relevant to this topic is he's done over 50 days of reserve duty in this war. He had a high-ranking position. He was the head of operations in Gaza at the beginning of the war. Now, Knesset members are usually exempt from doing reserve duty, and in fact, they're discouraged from doing reserve duty, but he insisted, and he later wrote a book about it, which is available in Hebrew. I found it very interesting. I even interviewed him. For those who don't read Hebrew, you can find it. I interviewed him about it for Jewish Insider. And our second guest is Moshe Roth, who was a Knesset member until a few weeks ago because of this complicated thing in Israel called the Norwegian law. But he was in the United Torah Judaism party, which is the Ashkenazi Haredi party. Basically, when their ministers resigned from Israel's governing cabinet, it bumped him out of the Knesset. But he grew up in the U.S. and is now based in Netanya and has senior positions in there's a hospital in Netanya that was established by a Hasidic rabbi, and he was involved there before becoming a member of Knesset. Now, we are talking to these two Knesset members because they are on two different sides of the debate over Haredi conscription into the IDF. And I believe we talked about it a little bit last week, but I'll give a very, very quick sort of crash course about what's happening there. This has been a political debate for decades at this point. There was, in theory, a law that settled it 25 years ago, but over the years, many Israelis continue to believe that it was unfair that Haredim were not conscripted into the IDF the way secular and religious Zionist Israelis are, and Druze among non-Jewish Israelis. And the Supreme Court in 2023 struck down what was the latest in a series of laws trying to regulate the situation, which means that since 2023, there has not actually been an exemption for Haredim, for the Ultra-Orthodox, from conscription into the IDF. It has not been on the books. That being said, the government wasn't doing it. So there have been court orders that says the government needs to actively go and conscript Haredim. Otherwise, they will face the penalties that are in the law, which have to do things with you can't leave the country, you can't get a driver's license. In some situations, you might go to prison. But the government also isn't even sending draft notices to most Haredi young men who are of the right age. Right? You're supposed to initially you get at 17, you get invited to come and take tests. So the IDF places you in the best place. And they're only sending out a few thousand of those, I think, in the last year. There's been a debate in the Knesset over a bill that would institute penalties for Haredim, right? If they don't enlist. And it would penalize the yeshivas as institutions that are that are encouraging people to dodge the draft. But in reality, right, this is how the bill's being presented. In reality, what it does is kick the can down the road, because the discussion in many cases, or what the Haredim want out of this bill, is to have the penalties be postponed for another year at least, and in some cases more than that, so that in the coming years, no Haredi man will actually be penalized for not enlisting in the IDF. So you have some who argue, actually no law needs to be passed. We could just stick with what exists and should actually enforce the law. Anyway, we now have a situation where there's no bill. The Haredim feel like that Prime Minister Netanyahu and others in the coalition made all kinds of promises to them that they would regulate this, but they haven't managed to do it because they've not had the votes, and also because the Knesset member, Yuli Edelstein, who was sort of responsible for drafting the bill, insisted on there being reasonable penalties. And so the United Torah Judaism left the coalition over this, and Shas half left. They have like 1 foot in and 1 foot out. So there is a chance that there will be an election over this, but if there's anything, I don't think it will happen until next year, just because of the parliamentary schedule, and also because Shas only took this half step. And also Edelstein was replaced as the head of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee by Boaz Bismuth, who's a different Knesset member from Likud. And Likud hopes that he will be more amenable to the Haredi demands to keep up the coalition. So we're going to start with member of Knesset Tur-Paz, who is in favor of conscripting Haredim into the IDF, to talk about why, to talk about where things stand politically, and what he thinks the solution should be.
Member of Knesset Tur-Paz, it's a great pleasure to have you on the Miskav Mideast Horizons podcast. Thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. We want to talk today about the issue of drafting the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi population. And you tweeted in December 2024, you wrote, and I'm translating freely from the Hebrew, "I feel like the Haredim fooled us. Years of work, years of intense work to integrate them into the army, while we paid close attention to their needs and to a dialogue with them. And at the end of the day, at the moment of truth, they left us alone. They don't want us to adapt to their needs. They don't want at all. I changed my mind. We tried a dialogue and they played a game with us. And now it's time for criminal and economic sanctions." So should you take us back and explain a little bit what the issue is and what led you to change your mind?
Yes, so we could go back 70 years to the meeting of David Ben-Gurion and the Chazon Ish in the 50s, when the first leave for ultra-Orthodox people that were learning Torah was given by Prime Minister Ben-Gurion. And at the time, there were 400 Bachur Yeshiva Bachurs learning Torah in Israel. Now, I come from a modern Orthodox family. My family, all my family has both learned in yeshiva and served in the army since my father made Aliyah in the 50s until today, where my third child has gone into the army. So I see it, first of all, or maybe foremost, as a personal issue. As a Torah learner that learns Torah today too, and as my children and myself learn Torah, and sees no contradiction between learning Torah seriously, deeply, and serving in the Israeli army. Now, as we speak today, there are over 90,000 Haredi yeshiva bachas that are not serving in the army. So they're using the leave that was given in the 50s and not serving in the army. Now, there's been a big change because 2 years ago, the law in Israel that allowed that expired. This was June 23. And since then, it's been illegal not to serve in the army. Now, 11 years ago, I built one of the first units for Ultra-Orthodox boys. It was in the Givati unit, and it's called Tomer, and they serve till today. That was one of the first units in the army that brought in Haredi boys, gave them whatever they needed to continue and be Haredi as their belief, and yet serve in the army. They served in this war. They did a tremendous work. 2 years later, I was approached by the army itself, and they said we want another unit like that. And I formed a second unit in the paratroopers. So I'm deeply invested in integrating Haredi boys into the army and showing it can be done. When the 7th of October happened, and I myself, aged then 51, went to serve in the army. As an MK, I was one of 3 MKs that actually served in this war, and I was chief of operations in the Gaza division. I started serving like hundreds of thousands other reserve soldiers, and I was sure that we'll see a change. And for a short while, there was a feeling in the Israeli society that something is happening. The Haredi community is understanding. This is a different time. This is Milchemet Mitzvah. This is what was saying. This is time. If not now, when? And after a few months, when I came back to Knesset, I actually saw that Olam Kiminal it's exactly the same. And there was no upgrade, and there were no Haredi boy, almost none, that were going to the army. And specifically when we saw soldiers killed and thousands injured, and the army was saying we must have more soldiers, no one came. And that was when something broke inside me. And I reached out to my colleagues here in parliament. Some of them, I can almost call them friends from the Haredi Miflagot. I was in the Jerusalem municipality. Some of them were then sitting on the board of the municipality in Jerusalem. And I know them very well, Goldknop and Pindrus and Malkieli and others. And I told them, if not now, then when? And nothing happened. And then after starting to work on the legislation in the Committee of Security and Foreign Affairs, Vadat Chutz U'Bitachon, a year ago, we started to work on a new legislation. And I said, we're here, but this is not a leave for the Haredim not to serve. This is the way for them to serve and keep their emunah and keep their way of life, and we'll give whatever's needed for that. But we just need soldiers, and most specifically fighters. And here we are today, as we speak, almost 2 years from the 7th of October, and yet nothing has changed. And we gave so much time, and we put so much effort. And I told you, I built units, and you can say, wow, Kinley, you've done not a bad job. I mean, 1,500 soldiers have served in those units for the last decade, and that's great. But they are less than 2% the Haredi society. And if you look at numbers more specifically, today as we speak, this July 25, we had 14,000 Haredi boys graduating yeshiva, which is equivalent to 12th grade in a high school. Those 14,000 Haredi boys are quarter exactly of the Jewish boys graduating school in Israel today, of the Jewish boys, those who are by law given to must serve in the army, and most of them, 90-something% of them, are not serving. That's not heard of. So as I see it, it's not only, this is a moral issue, this is a Jewish issue, this is a professional issue, it's a matter of life and death. And for me, it's even very personal.
You talk about it being a matter of life and death. The Haredim make this argument that the army doesn't really want them because it's too difficult, because, you know, they have a higher level of kashrut, because they want to be on military bases without women. Could you tell us, based on what you've heard from the army as being a member of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, sort of what the army's needs are and what they are willing to do to integrate Haredim?
So I'll give you more or less the numbers. First, I'll tell you, I spoke personally with the last 3 chiefs of IDF, the current one, Zamir, the one before, Herzi Halevi, the one before him, Kochavi, specifically on the serving of Haredi boys in the army. And I told them then and now that we'll have to integrate Haredim into the army because the numbers and the percentages and where we're going demographically is, I told Aviv Kochavi 5 or 6 years ago, Israel won't survive as a country without Haredi boys. This was my talk with him. Now, before 7th of October, this was a debate. And there were actually a few generals in the army that claimed we'll deal without them. Let them go and work, let them go and serve their belief. We don't need them serving in the army. Since the 7th of October, it's now a consensus. There's no debate. Look, the army, I can't give you the actual numbers because they're discrete, but I'll give you in general. What we had on the 7th of October in fighting units, in battalions in the army, is now more or less double. Well, today we need about a double than that. So if we had a few tens of battalions serving on our borders in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Judah and Samaria, we now today need double that number in order to hold our posts, not to conquer Gaza, not to fight in Lebanon, just to hold the borders. Lebanon.
Can you explain why is there this growth?
What we saw on the 7th of October, that the numbers style decided, the IDF said, this can hold, that the government said, we need this as this big of an army, didn't hold. We saw 4 battalions holding the Gaza Strip on the 7th of October, and they collapsed. Those 4 battalions didn't hold the line, and the line was taken by 5,000 or 6,000 Hamas fighters who came in. And if it wasn't for a few thousand Israelis running to the border and holding back, taking back that area, and if Hezbollah would have joined in the north, Israel would be in real danger of its existence. Now, because of what happened on the 7th of October, we understand we can't take any risks. Before the 7th of October, people were saying we can hold a small army, what they called it a small and wise army, but and we can have technology and air force, and they'll take the place of soldiers. Today, everybody knows you need boots on the ground. So if at the time it was X battalions, today we need the double X. Now, because the IDF serving didn't go, and actually we lost 13,000 soldiers who were injured or killed in this army, 13,000. No one took their place. So the army has actually shrunken, and no one took that place. So at the moment, what we're doing is putting reserve soldiers. Now, I've been a reserve soldier and commander for 30 years now. And I used to serve 30, 50, 70 days. We have today reserve soldiers serving 200 and 300 days. That can't hold. A country can't hold its people, hundreds of thousands, that's serving hundreds of days. So, understanding that, we need a bigger army. Now, who took the place of the Haredi boys? The secular girls. We have 20% of the directors of IDF are girls, are women. Most of them secular, some modern Orthodox, that are serving as fighters on our borders. That's because the Haredis didn't come in. But if we want to grow, if we need a bigger army, the only potential we have is the Ultra-Orthodox. So that's the reason we're dependent on bringing in, integrating more Haredi boys, serving mainly in fighting units. The army said, I need about 12,000 more. 12,000 more. There's no potential besides the Ultra-Orthodox boys.
So let's talk now about the current situation, right? So 2 years ago, the court sort of canceled the existing laws, and right now it's kind of unregulated, or it's the Haredim fall under the general law, right? You have the same penalties, consequences as anybody else who decides to dodge the draft. I've heard some people make the argument that that's how it should be, that you don't need to pass a special law. What do you think needs to be done?
I actually agree with that saying. I mean, the law that expired June 23, there wasn't a change. That the ancient law expired and there wasn't a new law. The law says every youngster in Israel has to serve in the army unless he's given a leave. Now, the leave was given for religious women and for non-Jewish. So if you're a Jewish boy, you have to serve in the army. And the tens of thousands that are not serving. And the only thing that's needed in order that I think a lot, not all, but a lot of Jewish boys learning in yeshivas, or not learning, but using the leave of yeshivas will serve, is using the current law and the sanctions that the law gives government and haven't been used. So it's an absurd. All Ultra-Orthodox boys until a year ago didn't even get the paper calling them to serve. So they were saying, why should I serve? I didn't get the paper. Now some got it but threw it to the dustbin. Some, the yeshiva got it and threw it to the dustbin. Some ignored it, but there was no sanctions. There was no, and this was even some kind of discrimination, because if you are secular child, you got it. If you are modern Orthodox, you got it. If you are not Orthodox, you didn't get it. So there was a discrimination of the Haredi boys that they got to leave automatically. And this has changed now. And the army, for the first time for many years, is sending the tzavim to the papers, even to the Ultra-Orthodox children. And this is why the Haredi parties are so on the edge. This is why they left the government. They didn't leave coalition, but they left government because they said for the first time, we have tens of thousands of boys that are called to the army. They are what we call mishtamtim. And if they don't serve, there are sanctions that automatically start working. Now, sadly enough, the government, because it needs the Haredi parties, didn't use the sanctions that it can. Now, we know today, I mean, it's widespread, but it's also focused on Israel. Like other people, Haredi people also go by sanctions. So if you take from someone, you take his money and you prevent him going abroad, and he's on the edge of losing a lot of his budget. So at least 30, 40, 50% of Haredi boys will serve if Israel does its job. I think the others still will take that, very harsh sanctions and will say, for sticking in yeshiva, I'll pay the price. But at least 50%, I think if we go by law, will serve in the army.
Could you explain then the political situation now? Because on the one hand, you have a law that would seemingly do what you would like it to do, which is place the sanctions on those who don't come and serve. But in what seems to be the case now, there's a fight over whether there should be a law, what kind of law, and it's the parties, it's whether it's the former head of the committee, Yuli Edelstein, or the parties that are favoring drafting are pushing for a new law. The current coalition should be pushing either for delaying a law or some sort of watered down law. Can you explain a little bit, what the situation is, the political situation in the committee, and then what kind of law do we need given what currently exists?
So there are actually three sides to this answer. One is the current law, as I said, allows, and I think even gives all the options to bring in the Haredi boys in the army. The army also has made a big change, built units for Haredi, the Chatmonaim units, and the former units I built, so there's no problem. And as I said, the only thing is the sanctions that the law has given haven't been used. So this is the abnormal situation. If we would have the current law from June 23, with using of the sanctions, I think we'd see tens of thousands of Haredi boys going into the army. That's the number one option. I think that's the best option. Then we have the second option, which is, as I said, the abnormal, which we had until now, that we had a law, but the government didn't go by the law. So the government, the current government, the Likud government, because it's dependent on the Haredi parties, use the law that it has and actually stop the sanctions. And that's the abnormal situation we have till now. And then there's this third situation, that this is what the Haredi want. They don't want the current law, and they don't want to depend on the givings of government. They want a new law, which will give by law every Haredi boy that wants, which will be registered in yeshiva, the leave to continue in yeshiva, get the belts and not serve. That's what they aim. You try compromise and say, look, I'll give you a new law, but it won't let any child go to yeshiva, only if you prove you're serious in yeshiva, and let's say we'll have 50% of Haredim still learning in yeshiva and 50% will serve, which is much better than the current situation, and yet it's still not fair because you give a Haredi boy a privilege you don't give to other children in Israel. So that's what Yuli was trying to do. So the situation at the moment is the first one. We have a law from 2023. We have sanctions that step by step are becoming harsher and stronger, and hopefully will conclude by a lot of Haredi youngsters going into the army, unless there's new legislation. And what will be the new legislation, we don't know. We know the Likud, led by Netanyahu, has kicked out Yuli Edelstein. Next week, Boaz Mislot is supposed to come in his shoes. It's not yet final, but that's what's supposed to be. And then if Boaz Mislot comes into leadership of the committee, then we'll see the committee redealing, rethinking, and maybe bringing the new legislation. How will that look? Will the Haredi compromise and say, it's new legislation, it's better than what we would get with Yuli, so we'll go for it? Or maybe they say, no, even if it's a very good legislation, I can't have Haredi boys going into the army by law. I'm willing if it's, if you force them, okay, but I won't give them the law. Anything can happen from now. As an opposition leader, as a yeshiva modern Orthodox person, I believe, as I said, we don't need legislation. All we need is to give a sum of, let's say, 1,500 boys a year, which is about 10%, which will give the leave to what we call Iluim, the high standard Torah learning. They will be given the leave out of the army. And as I see it, the other 90% should serve as done in modern Orthodox, in Tzionut Datit, and as done in secular. That would be my law if I would be leading this situation.
I want to ask you about the politics of this, because I think polling is very clear that most Israelis are on your side of this argument. But I think that was the case even before the war, and now it's even more so. And you look at the voters for Likud, you look at the voters for other right-wing parties, they also, a majority of them, or half of them, are on your side of this argument. And yet the coalition politics, right, the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu needs the Haredi parties in order to stay in office, seems to take over sort of the public view of this. Do you think that there's any hope? I mean, in 2013, our listeners might not remember, Yesh Atid, your party was you weren't there yet, but your party was part of the coalition. They passed a law that tried to bring Haredim into the army. And then 2 years later, there was an election and the law was canceled by the new coalition that included Haredim. So, do you see a political possibility of this actually changing long term?
I think you could look at politics divided now in four. Opposition I'm part of, which is 40-something% of set. We're saying legislation, Haredi to the army, there's no question. On the second side, the Haredi party, they're now 15% of the Knesset, was saying no army, no service, Some of them are saying, okay, maybe those are not serving, but that's the main agenda. We want the current situation to continue with no change. Those are the two sides. In the middle, we have the right voters, of course, but Haredim, that's 40 of 50 Knesset members. Likud, Tzionut Datit, and Otzma Yehudit. Those are all people that are serving in the army. What are they saying? And they are the most important because they're part of coalition. They're divided into two parts. Some are going with the Haredim and saying, look, we think we need the Haredim, we need service, but the right-wing coalition is more important. That's one group. And they're saying, we'll go with the Haredim because they've given us government and we'll give them the leave. I think they're a minority, but they're a group. I think most of the right-wing voters, as you said, most of the coalition voters think there has to be a change. They're even speaking about building a new coalition without the Haredim, convincing the Haredim to change. Those are the talks. Because of that, I'm a bit optimistic because I think the majority of the Israeli people understand there has to be a change. And if you haven't changed after 7th of October, and this is what I tweeted, what you were quoting before, if you haven't changed after the 7th of October, something is wrong about you. I was telling one of the leaders of the Haredi parties, I was saying exactly this. I told him, sadly enough, this was after another day of a few friends, colleagues, lost their children. I told him, you haven't passed the 7th of October. It's as if it doesn't, you're not a part of it. I mean, I told one of the MKs, the Haredi MKs, I told him, listen, how many people do you know personally who lost their children in this country? I know over 20. Only yesterday I visited a friend, he's not in the 20s, he's over the 20, that lost his friend half a year ago in Gaza. You don't see it as a personal issue. No one of the family is serving. You're as if you're not part of us now. It's very sad to say. That's why I feel so betrayed, because I've been working, I'm still working, building the bridges to education, Haredi education, to Haredi savers, to Haredi working. And then we passed the 7th of October, the most deadly day since the Holocaust, and no change. Nothing was changed. We've invested enormous sums of money in Haredi units. We've given what every Haredi boy wants to serve. We haven't even spoken about the girl, although my girl serves in the army, my wife served in the army. We're talking only about the boys. And nothing has changed. You haven't put one little effort in the fighting of Gaza. That's something, as I see, as a very hard point. And yet, I'm saying I'm optimistic because I think a big majority of Israelis understand this has to change. And even there's a minority in the Haredi society. They're not voting at the moment, they're not going to the army, but there's a minority, I think a growing minority that understands something has to change.
Thank you very much, member of Knesset Moshe Kinley Tur-Paz. Thank you very much for joining us and for explaining this issue to our listeners.
Thank you very much, Theo.
Okay, now we welcome our next guest, former Knesset member Moshe Roth of United Torah Judaism. We want to hear from your perspective where you think things stand in the parliamentary debate, I would say, when it comes to conscription of Haredim into the IDF.
First of all, thank you for having me, and I've heard about your podcast that your listeners are considered to be intellectual. So it's I think says a lot about what you have. And to your question, it's very hard to say on a certain standpoint. It's more of I would say a combination of certain points. The whole idea of conscription, the whole idea of the draft law, is, as you know, it has many angles. When you're talking about the political angle, although it's contentious, and I'm sorry to say this, but it's true that many see this as sort of a ticket. It's a beneficial. It's beneficial for elections. So many parties like to use this as some kind of a tool in a certain sense, it has been weaponized, and politically, of course, meaning the whole idea. So it's hard to say that it's like we're sitting around the table and trying to find a solution. It is not so, because, as I said, many have put the political part in it is, in a certain sense, way off mark and is inefficient and doesn't create any solution. In fact, it creates the problem, because let me just give you a very important example. Every year we have about, I would say, anywhere between 3,000 to 5,000 Haredi youth that is enlisted. Okay, it's more or less those are the numbers. But in the last 2 years, this has gone down, which is very, it's interesting, because in the beginning, after October 7, more than 7,000 people actually tried to enlist, but at the end, less than 200 were accepted, which goes to show you that there's a lot of, because the extreme brings extreme. So when you say the political arena, which is the one you're asking about, we have to divide that into two. The political arena, those that use this as political, a political point, and those that do want to find a solution. Well, now, right now, at this point, I'm optimistic, because there's a change in what's going on actually in regard to the committee, the security committee, which is supposed to propose this law. And I believe that the change, who became the chairman, that will make sort of will make it happen. I really hope so.
There's two different debates, it seems, going on at the same time. On the one hand, those who are arguing that Israel, from a security perspective, since October 7th, the IDF needs many more soldiers. There are more threats. We saw that we need more people on the border. We saw that the reservists who've done, 5-6 rounds of reserve duty already, and they need more soldiers. And then there are some, certainly not all, but some who argue that no, we don't want to go to the IDF no matter what. We'd rather, there have even been those who have said we would prefer to move abroad than to serve in the IDF. That's sort of one debate. And obviously there's middle ground. There's another debate, which is the approach, we would say, positive incentives, the idea of creating new units, avoiding using the stick, avoiding using sanctions. There are those who claim that's what's actually going to lead more people into the draft. And there are those who claim that, no, we've tried that for 10, 15 years, and the numbers of ultra-Orthodox men that are serving in a combat role or in a very substantial role are still very small. The growth is very small. There's ups, there's downs, but overall the numbers have remained small. Therefore, we need to change approach, and we need to take the approach of economic sanctions, criminal sanctions, restrictions, etc. Where do you fall on those two debates?
And with your permission, I think it's important for me to answer that. I would like to take a step back, okay, and in a broader picture perspective, and try to be subjective about the whole issue. Objective, I'm sorry. First of all, as if we agree to basic principles, okay, and basic principles meaning, for example, seeing Torah study as part of I would say it's part of, I would say, on par at least with serving the army, because we're talking about a fundamental part of what Jews are, and this has been going on for the last 3,500 years. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And this is, if we see this as a vital contribution to the moral fabric, or the spiritual fabric, or the even the national fabric of the state of Israel, if we have that in common, if we share the same values, then we could talk about the rest, about the practical part. Okay, and the truth is that many agree to this principle. Those that don't, either because they're not familiar, or they don't see this, it's not important to them, or whatever. But as a general level, this was also the status quo that Ben Gurion in the beginning wanted a part of the status quo, part of sort of the so-called agreement between the two sides at the beginning of the creation of the State of Israel, was to consider Torah study, as I said, a vital contribution to the existence of the Jewish people. Okay, now if we agree to that part, then we have to agree to the other point. The other point is that I would say there's the secular part and there's the religious part. This is something which is a fact. The IDF at the moment has a very, I would call it a sort of a drive, okay, to be as secular as possible. Okay, that is it is progressive movement. Everything is co-ed. The IDF is spending a lot of manpower to make that happen, and then suddenly you want youth, the Haredi youth, which are totally ultra-Orthodox and religious, and they need this a different lifestyle, and you want to combine these two. Now, of course, it's not going to work unless you find a real solution. That's number one. Number two, this is a very important point. Before you go to the solution, you have to understand the problem, and then there's another part. When we talk about manpower, this is an illusion. The IDF has no lack of manpower. I repeat, no lack of manpower. The only problem is that the IDF in the last 2 decades have minimized combat units. They've closed combat units because there was this conception that a small technological army, it was called a small smart army, and that is sort of was a misconception because of what happened after October 7. So that's the issue. The issue is that there are less combatants, okay, but there's no lack of manpower. And the truth is, there is even a surplus of manpower when we're not talking non-combat units.
I'm sure you're aware there are reservists who have done hundreds of days.
And I have the highest respect to all those that did this work. They're doing the work. In fact, the problem is that they are doing sort of making up for the gap that the IDF has created in the last 2 decades, because the burden falls in the IDF. The burden falls on a very small part, a very small segment of the reserves. It's not because there's a lack of manpower, because the manpower that is sitting in the Kiryat in Tel Aviv, in the headquarters, and sitting all over in all these bases and literally not doing anything, is those were never taken into combat and formed combat units. So this gap has nothing to do with the Haredi part, which is only is about 12% of the population. So and never mind that there are many more draft dodgers in the secular community in numbers, not in percentage, in numbers, than in the religious community. And when you take all of that together, of course, if everybody would sit down at the table based upon these basic issues, which is on one hand Torah study, on the other hand respecting and finding solutions to religious youth to be able to join that, those, when you take those two things into consideration, there is a solution. In fact, there was a solution.
The IDF says they don't have enough manpower, and not everyone's suited to be a combat soldier, right?
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Fine, they don't have enough combat soldiers. Not everyone's suited to be a combat soldier, right? Presumably, if somebody's sitting behind a desk in Tel Aviv, it's because they're not suited to be a combat soldier. I know there's some exceptional cases, like someone's lactose intolerant and they don't want to bring special food to the army base. I know that's like an example people like to give, but I think that those are not huge numbers, right? And my understanding is that there are 19,000 Haredi men who are of the right age, and that some percentage of them could be combat soldiers, and obviously some percentage of them would not be. But the thing that I don't understand is why Haredim who are not studying Torah all the time, right? Who are in institutions for people who have, these like yeshivas that are for people who really are not suited to sit in a yeshiva all day, or people who are just working on the black market because they aren't actually in any kind of yeshiva. Why can't they be in the army, in these special units, special army bases that have been designated to suit a Haredi lifestyle?
They could. I'm not contradicting that. In fact, what you just said is if only everybody would agree to what you just said. I mean, the Haredi community has agreed to this sort of solution or arrangement many times. There is no problem with that. In fact, that is a very good arrangement, and it has worked in previous certain many. It has worked. There was something called Shachar Kahol, and there were thousands of Haredi youth enrolled in this program, which was an army program which was focused on technology, and it worked until somebody had the idea to make it co-ed, and then it sort of dissolved. That is exactly the point. You hit the nail on the head. As long as these guidelines and these brackets, okay, are kept, then definitely we have a solution. But with extreme, when somebody tries to make extreme, when suddenly you send 50,000 draft lists, and you start to raise sanctions to make them impossible to accept, of course, that what happens is that the extreme it makes it extreme on the other side. So yes, you're definitely right. Yeshiva students should be exempt, and non-yeshiva students should join the army.
I want to just make clear, I didn't say that.
No,
that's
this was something that would work. I don't. It's not a personal opinion. It's not my opinion or your opinion. If we want to discuss something that may work and be beneficial, the bottom line is always one thing. The question is, what would serve the army in the best way? Which of all solutions should people be forced to go to the army? Should people be jailed? Will that bring more combatants, or will an agreement bring combatants? At the bottom line, the question is, what would be a solution that would help the army, not what would be somebody's rosy dream. That's not the point. Okay, the question is, what's practical? What could work? What you suggested would work exactly, absolutely. But when you have to take the politicians out of the picture. People who use this whole idea, the whole problem, as a political benefit or a political ticket. The judicial intervention, which has created a lot of issues, a lot of problems. So we can't come to an agreement, although it's a social agreement. It has nothing to do with this law or that law. It's more of an idea of the equality, and so these foreign sort of ideas in fact they are the problem, not the solution.
Has there been a change within the Haredi community since October 7th, since the almost 2 years of ongoing war? Has that had an impact on the outlook of the Haredi leadership, the Haredi youth, in terms of how they see the state of Israel and their role in it? Or is sort of what was is what will be, and the events of October 7th and the subsequent war don't change that in any substantive way?
It's a tricky question. I'll tell you why. Because both what you said, both options are true. Meaning, definitely there is much more of a feeling. I think it's not only the Jewish the Haredi community that has this sentiment. It's all over Israel. Everybody has the sentiment that things have changed, and then we less rely, so to speak, on the world. Less we rely on whatever the world has to offer, from the United Nations down to the media and so forth, and of course the Arabs themselves that are living in Gaza or all those proxies of Iran. but internally speaking, of course, it has made a major change. It made a change in is sort of in not only being part of the seeing what is called the pikuach nefesh idea, what's called the great danger that literally that the people were on the same day. So of course this created a lot of bursts of wanting to join the army and wanting to be part of the defense operation. Definitely. But on the other hand, it has always been so. This is a misconception that as if the Haredi people don't feel part of this point in Israeli society. That's not what divides us. What divides the Haredi community is the will not to change their tradition. That is what's important. There is nothing to do with defense or care. In fact, this on the contrary. I think that the Haredi community has always had this feeling of responsibility for the general public, and one point that it just that shows you how far it goes. Most of the volunteer service in Israel is done by Haredi people. And if you take just one part, like for example, we're talking about the health issues, anything that has to do with health, for example, it is 7 times as much in money, in manpower, that it would down the line, most organizations that deal in volunteer work are Haredi organizations. They're only the Haredi people are 12% of the population, but they have 70% and more of the volunteer work that is done. There are 250,000, according to Yediot Ahronot, 250,000 Haredi people who volunteer on a daily basis for public service. So you have a society that is so keen on contributing and being part of the general society, and the same goes for defense, by the way. When you talk about responsibility, the bottom line, the question is the environment, is it suitable or is it not suitable? Is the idea of joining the IDF a defense idea, or it's a social idea to change the way of life of the Haredi people? As long as the Haredi people feel that the goal is not a defense, the goal is more to change them, they will be more have more. I would say they would have less trust. Okay, less trust in the army officials. And what happened in the last 2 years on the political arena made it only worse.
I want to ask you about the politics. The polling shows that most Israelis disagree with the Haredi community and the Haredi political position on this issue, and that the numbers, even in the traditional coalition partners of United Torah Judaism, right, the right-wing parties, including the modern Orthodox or religious Zionist right-wing parties, they're also a majority now disagree with the Haredim, whereas in the past it was, the majority actually were okay with this exemption. So now United Torah Judaism is out of the coalition. Is there any political alternative for them going forward? Let's say this does bring about an election.
First of all, before I answer your question, I just want to comment on what you said. There's definitely very bad or vicious propaganda against the Haredi community. And if you let me make analogy, I would say that what happens to Jewish people all over the world, what happens to Israelis all over the world, to Israel all in the media, it happens internally between the secular and the Haredi community. It's interesting because it's the same topics and the same accusations, and at the same time, suddenly we are considered the state of Israel are considered the bad part in the war in Gaza, and and even some Israelis have said the worst things about the IDF. And in the whole world, everybody, they're chanting and the slogans are against the IDF. And again, I don't want to repeat them, those terrible, terrible slogans that are going on. And this all comes from a certain propaganda that is being focused against the state of Israel and against the IDF. Well, the same happens internally with the Haredi. Now the Haredim have become the victim of this propaganda, which is initiated and viciously pointed at the Haredi community. And instead of seeing the Haredi community as the most contributing community in the state of Israel, and instead of seeing the specialty of the tradition that we are upholding, and suddenly we are the ones that are creating the problem in the IDF for all those reserves, and which is not true in number wise, and it's not true factually not true, because it's the IDF has built this program in the last 20 years, and it's something which cannot be changed in 1 year. So that is my remark on the way things are. But in answer to your question in a nutshell, it's not a political issue. So it's not a political alternative. The leaving the government or being part of the government is not only a political implication. It is also an implication of can we be part of a government that literally I don't want to use sharp words, but are not welcome to yeshiva students, to say the least, or can we be part of such a government, or cannot be part of such a government? That is the point. There are many in the political arena which want to use this swaying, and they want to topple the government. So to them, the Haredim leaving Netanyahu is a win-win situation, especially since they have offered for the Haredi people anything we want, from a draft law to any kind of budget issues. And many times they have offered this, and they will offer it again and again. So to us, it's not a political issue at all. It is an issue of values and what's important in the long run, and not in the short run.
Thank you very much, former Knesset member Moshe Roth, for explaining the position to our listeners.
Thank you very much for having me, and I do hope that we do reach a solution. It is important for us. The unity of the society in Israel is important to each and every one of us, and we don't live with slogans. And I personally, and not UTJ, we don't support any of those slogans that people say that is no meaning to us. It's not the Torah way, and it's definitely not beneficial. And we hope that very soon all soldiers will be able to come home, and all the hostages will come home, and we'll finally have peace and quiet. Let's settle for quiet, if not peace, but at least quiet in the whole state of Israel, and the whole Eretz Yisrael, and for all Jewish people all over the world.
Amen.
Thank you for listening to this week's Miskav Mideast Horizons podcast. You can follow the Miskav Institute at www.miskavins.org and on all social media platforms. You can also send your comments and questions to mideasthorizonspodcast@gmail.com, and we look forward to seeing you next week.